I need the money for my father's medical treatment." With these 9 words, Shubhada Kodare convinced her colleague Krishna to lend her 4 lakh over 2 years. The truth? Her father was perfectly healthy. The discovery that would eventually lead to her death in a bloody parking lot confrontation. The relationship between victim and killer began innocently enough. We gashed 2 co-workers at a Pune call center. But as we rewind from the shocking footage of Shubhada bleeding on the pavement, we uncover how small deceptions snowballed into a premeditated murder that played out in front of dozens of witnesses who did nothing but record on their phones. What turns an ordinary office relationship into the perfect setting for deception? In the fluorescent-lit world of WNS Global Services, Shubhada and Krishna's story began like countless others. 2 junior colleagues navigating the corporate landscape together, sharing lunch breaks and office celebrations, forming the kind of casual friendship that defines modern work life. For Krishna, their relationship was unremarkable, just another workplace connection built on proximity and shared experiences. These seemingly insignificant workplace bonds create the perfect environment for vulnerability. The daily rhythms of office life, seeing the same faces, sharing professional struggles, celebrating small victories, quietly build trust without us realizing it's happening. By the time Shubhada and Krishna had worked together for 8 months, their relationship had developed that familiar workplace intimacy where personal lives occasionally spill into professional spaces. The first request came during an ordinary lunch break. Shubhada mentioned her father's sudden illness, a heart condition requiring immediate medical attention. With medical costs mounting and family resources stretched thin, she turned to Krishna with a request that seemed reasonable at the time, a loan of 25,000 to help cover her father's treatment. Krishna, moved by her visible distress and the urgency of her family's situation, agreed without hesitation. This initial exchange established a dangerous pattern. When Shubhada returned 2 weeks later with tearful gratitude and news that her father needed additional procedures, Krishna's defenses were already lowered. The second request came with apologies but carried the same emotional weight. A family in crisis, a daughter desperate to save her father. The amount increased to wave 50 Ts, 000, still within the realm of what might be considered a significant but not extraordinary favor between colleagues. What Krishna couldn't see was the careful psychological manipulation at work. Each request came after Shubhada had observed Krishna's sympathetic reaction to others' problems during team meetings. She strategically mentioned her father's condition during moments when Krishna appeared most receptive, often after he had shared stories about his own family. This targeted approach allowed her to exploit not just his financial resources, but his emotional availability. As months passed, the requests grew more frequent, and the amounts larger. By the 4th month of this arrangement, Shubhada had established a rhythm, approaching Krishna roughly every 3 weeks, with a new complication in her father's treatment. Each story built upon the last complications from surgery, specialized medication from abroad, private nursing care. The narrative expanded, but always centered on her father's deteriorating health and her family's increasing desperation. Meanwhile, Krishna faced his own medical crisis. Diagnosed with a serious ophthalmic disorder, he began saving for surgery that would cost approximately 3 lakh. This created the perfect storm. Krishna understood medical emergencies intimately now, making Shubhada's pleas even more resonant, while simultaneously facing financial pressure that made each loan to her more significant. Experts in financial exploitation point to this case as a textbook example of how trust becomes weaponized. In relationships with emotional investment, Manipulators create false emergencies that trigger empathetic responses, explains Dr. Meera Sharma, psychologist specializing in financial abuse. The victim becomes emotionally invested in the fabricated narrative, making it nearly impossible to refuse continued support. By the time the total reached 4 lakh, nearly equivalent to Krishna's annual salary, he had become entirely enmeshed in Shubhada's fictional emergency. The ordinary office friendship had transformed into an extraordinary financial entanglement, with Krishna now financially and emotionally invested in the recovery of a man he had never met. The most dangerous moment in any deception isn't when the first lie is told, it's when the first question is asked. As Krishna's vision deteriorated and his own surgery date approached, the money he'd given to Shubhada wasn't just a generous loan anymore. It had become a medical necessity for his own survival. His moment of truth arrived when he finally gathered the courage to ask for his money back. "I need the funds for my eye surgery," Krishna explained to Shubhada one morning before their shift began. What followed wasn't the understanding response of a grateful friend, but something far more troubling. Shubhada's face tightened as she launched into elaborate new complications with her father's treatment. Each question Krishna asked was met with increasingly detailed hospital stories and promises of just another few weeks that never materialized. Soon became Shubhada's favorite word. Soon the treatments would end. Soon her father would recover. Soon Krishna would get every rupee back. But as weeks passed and his vision worsened, Krishna began noticing inconsistencies in her stories, hospital names that changed, doctors whose specialties shifted, treatments that seemed implausible when he researched them online. It was a casual comment from another colleague that finally crystallized his suspicions. "Isn't it strange how healthy Shubhada's father looked in her Diwali family photo?" The photograph shared on social media showed a man who appeared remarkably robust for someone supposedly fighting for his life through multiple surgeries. The seed of doubt grew into something Krishna couldn't ignore. Making the decision to verify Shubhada's claims felt both necessary and somehow shameful, as if the act of checking meant he had already accepted her betrayal. Nevertheless, he requested time off, arranged transportation, and made the journey to Karad with the address he discreetly obtained from HR records. The modest home on the outskirts of Karad looked nothing like the site of ongoing family tragedy. When Krishna introduced himself to the elderly man tending the garden, the conversation that followed shattered his world completely. "I'm sorry, young man," Shubhada's father said, looking confused. "I haven't been sick at all. No surgeries, no hospital stays. I've been perfectly healthy these past months." The man even seemed offended at the suggestion of illness, proudly noting his daily yoga routine. Standing in that garden, Krishna felt something transform inside him. Betrayal trauma specialists describe this moment as a psychological rupture. When someone discovers they've been systematically deceived, their entire reality shifts. Trust doesn't just break, it inverts, turning what was once a positive relationship into something unrecognizable and threatening. Back at work, Krishna confronted Shubhada directly. Rather than confession or apology, she doubled down on her fabrications, adding new layers of increasingly implausible details. When gentle requests for repayment failed, his approaches became more insistent. Colleagues noticed their tense conversations in break rooms and the growing animosity between them. What Krishna didn't know was that Shubhada had already taken preemptive action. 3 months before the parking lot incident, she had filed a non-cognizable offense against Krishna, a legal maneuver that functioned as both shield and sword. By positioning herself as a victim of harassment, she effectively neutralized his legitimate financial claims against her. Each failed attempt to recover his money intensified Krishna's sense of helplessness. The system that should protect honest transactions seemed designed to shield the deceiver instead. His eye surgery date approached with no financial means to pay for it. Meanwhile, Shubhada continued her daily routines, seemingly untouched by the devastation she'd caused. Helplessness creates a breaking point, and for Krishna Satyanarayan Kanojia, it arrived at precisely 6:15 p.m. in the company parking lot. What happened next revealed not just one man's violent breaking point, but an equally disturbing response from those watching. 20 colleagues who raised phones instead of voices as a woman fought for her life. The most chilling aspect wasn't the attack itself, but what it uncovered about human nature when confronted with public violence. January 7, 2025 began as an ordinary workday at WNS Global Services, but Krishna arrived carrying something that had no place in an office environment. Hidden in his bag was a cleaver, its presence transforming a workplace into a potential crime scene. Throughout the day, Krishna moved through his tasks mechanically, the weight of his planned confrontation growing heavier with each passing hour. Security cameras captured him checking his watch repeatedly, his movements becoming increasingly agitated as the evening approached. The confrontation itself unfolded quickly. As Shubhada walked through the parking lot after her shift, Krishna intercepted her. Witnesses later reported hearing raised voices. His demands for repayment met with her familiar pattern of excuses and denials. When she turned to walk away, something snapped. The cleaver, concealed until that moment, flashed in the parking lot's harsh lighting as Krishna launched his attack. Security footage reveals a chilling detail about the assault. Krishna specifically targeted Shubhada's right elbow, inflicting multiple wounds to the same area. This precision wasn't random but deliberate, though Krishna couldn't have known the deadly consequence of his choice. The attack continued for nearly 2 minutes, during which time a crowd began to gather at what investigators later described as a safe distance. Perhaps the most disturbing moment came after Shubhada fell to the ground. As she desperately tried to call her father, Krishna took the phone from her bleeding hands. While she lay injured on the pavement, he calmly spoke to her father, reiterating his demand for repayment. The juxtaposition of this calculated action against the chaos he had just created speaks volumes about his mental state in those moments. What happened around this violent scene proves equally troubling. Approximately 20 co-workers witnessed the attack, yet not a single person physically intervened. Instead, many pulled out their smartphones, documenting the assault through their screens rather than stopping it. This phenomenon, known as the bystander effect, reached its modern technology-enhanced apex in that parking lot. Modern technology has transformed bystanders from potential rescuers into passive observers, explains criminal psychologist Dr. Anita Mehta. The act of recording creates psychological distance, converting witnesses into documentarians rather than participants. The phone becomes both shield and excuse. I'm doing something by recording when, in reality, they're doing nothing to help. The attack carried consequences beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Shubhada suffered from diabetes and hypoglycemia, conditions that severely compromised her body's ability to control bleeding. When the cleaver struck her elbow, it created wounds that, for someone with normal blood clotting, might have been survivable. For Shubhada, they proved catastrophic. She bled profusely during transport to the hospital, where medical professionals couldn't stabilize her condition in time. The bystander effect worked with terrible efficiency that evening. Each person present assumed someone else would take action, call security, attempt to stop Krishna, or provide first aid to Shubhada. This diffusion of responsibility, amplified by the crowd's size, effectively paralyzed everyone. Studies show that an individual alone witnessing an emergency will intervene 85% of the time, while those in groups act less than 31% of the time, a statistic tragically demonstrated in the WNS parking lot. In the wake of this tragedy, swift institutional responses have emerged. The National Commission for Women has not only condemned Shubhada's murder but demanded immediate action, giving Maharashtra police just 48 hours to file charges and submit a report. They formed a special fact-finding committee aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. Meanwhile, Krishna Kanojia sits in police custody, facing charges under the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita and Arms Act. His fate now in the hands of a legal system that must balance justice with context. But beyond the formal proceedings lies a more profound question for all of us. When does empathy become exploitation? When does justified anger transform into unforgivable violence? The public remains divided, some seeing Krishna as a victim driven to extremes, others viewing him as someone who crossed an unthinkable line. This case forces us to examine our own boundaries around lending money, our responses to betrayal, and perhaps most importantly, whether we would intervene in a moment of crisis or simply document another's suffering. The horror that unfolded in that parking lot ultimately reflects back on all of society, revealing how thin the membrane truly is between civilization and its collapse.